Hey, deserving listeners, this is part 4 in me reacting to the video on YouTube titled Andrew Tate Goes to Therapy. It is on the YouTube channel called Cobra Conquer. Let's watch.
Bad actions, right? And fooling ourselves about what they are, rationalizing. So I would argue that it's actually vital for you in the position that you are in and the responsibility that you have to actually confront your fear in a very real way, which probably goes back to your childhood. I mean, your dad was, the haircut story, and I don't know if you want to talk about that, if you're willing, but that's it. When I read that, I'm thinking about that little boy. It must have been fucking terrifying.
It is. Okay, another good move, in my opinion, that David, the therapist, is taking. One that I would take in situations like this as well. And it appears that David is trying to get at Andrew Tate's humanness and vulnerability for his benefit, for Andrew's benefit, I think. Again, you might hate Andrew Tate for good reasons and don't think he deserves to be in a session with a therapist that treats him well, but I can only comment on what I'm seeing. And so let's see what Andrew Tate says here. And he refers to some story that he went through as a kid with a haircut, which I think is interesting.
But I do think I had the best father on earth.
I'm not disputing that. I mean, there's a lot of good that came from your father. I'm not disputing that your father was...
Yeah, that was another good response by David, I think. And again, maybe David's a horrible person, a deplorable human being. I don't know. I just can only comment on what I'm seeing. But that is a good technique that David is using, that you get this defensiveness, which even people with emotional intelligence will do this. They will say, oh no, my dad was a good dad. And because they're not used to, we have this taboo often, particularly in some cultures, about talking at all negative about your parents in any way, particularly mothers, because you're disrespecting your parents by even bringing up the possibility that your parents weren't perfect with you. But there are certain models of therapy, I think David's shares this with me, that depend on or are oriented around this exploration and awareness that the things you went through as a child impacted you in such a way that developed defenses or schemas or behaviors or patterns that you're still living with today. Certain assumptions about the world and the way you see the world and the way you react to things has to do with the way you were parented in good ways and in bad ways. And when you make those connections, it can really help people with their awareness, with their self-compassion, with their corrective experiences, with not engaging in those defenses, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so you'll get that reaction from people. It's just like, no, my dad was a good person. Yeah. And the way that David reacted was pretty convincing. It's like, no, yeah, totally. But I'm just saying, so let's see what Andrew Tate says here.
He was a good man. Yeah. When you say he could go from 0 to 100 like that for a little boy,
it's scary.
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? We even heard Andrew Tate said scary. And when I hear that from people after investigating it, exploring it, typically I'll hear very horrific things have happened, and things that Andrew Tate probably doesn't even remember, because parents can lose their tempers with kids that are younger than 3-4 years old, and often will if they have a problem with that. And most people don't remember things from back then. They might remember glimpses, and especially if the trauma was chronic and ongoing, people might not remember generally what, I had a client once that had 0 memories prior to 10 years old. And we sent her to specialists and triangulate things like, looking at pictures. And she was working on a lot of things in therapy, but one of the things she was just curious about is like, how I want access to those memories. What's going on there? In the end, there was, no success with any of the things we tried. But the conceptualization that I had, because we knew enough, she did remember enough past 10 years old, we could sort of extrapolate what her pre-10 years were like. And the conceptualization that I came up with in collaboration with her is that her dad was abusive and suffered from alcohol addiction and was erratic and was abusive physically, particularly to her mom. He would beat his wife. And for the daughter, when she was 10, she remembered this, but we surmise it was probably happening for it. She was elected by the family system to be the placater of the dad when he would have those moments, and she would be the one to be his friend, and she would listen to him, and she would hang out with him. Her siblings had other roles, and the mom would disappear and had her own personality issues. But for my client, when she was young, she remembers being in that role when she was 10 and beyond. It's likely she had that role established when she was very young. And so she had to move in to the abusive, scary person. And she had no choice, right? Because the family needed her in that. And she felt like she had to do that for his sake, do it for the whole family's sake. So you could imagine that that would be a very scary situation, that you see your dad being very violent with your mom, and you know that it's your job to move toward the scary monster. And you also know that mom doesn't care enough about you to protect you from that. Mom might even say, go talk to your dad and you need to do your job or whatever. Your siblings are God knows where, and you're alone, you're afraid, you're terrified, and the dad at times would be very triggered and very drunk and would threaten murder of people. And she remembers stuff like that. So imagine what that would do to a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 7-year-old. Well, when we go through events like that, it can have profound effects on our neurology, and also we tend not to want to remember. We don't engage in recall. We don't reminisce about those days, and when we don't recall them, then the memories will fade faster. If you ask me what I did on a particular day 3 years ago, just a random day, there's extremely low likelihood I would remember anything that I did, even if you jogged my memory. Because on any random day, I'm probably not doing anything very notable, very novel, right? But when we do novel things, like if you have a birthday party or you crash your car or you graduate from school or something, it's so interesting that we tend to remember it. We have pictures and people will say, oh, how was graduation? You're like, and then you recall it and you say, when we do that, we have a much higher likelihood of remembering those events later on, the more times that we recall it. So for people that actively do not try to remember traumatic memories, then the details will get lost. The effects will still be with them, of course, because they went through that, but the specific memories. So you can exaggerate that to the extent where someone could have no memories prior to a certain age. Some of you might be in this category, actually. And that's the hypothesis that is often put forth. We can never really know because we can't open the brain and look at its gutty works and figure things out, but that's the way that it seems that memory works.
Fucking scary.
It is, but
that fear has to be in you. You don't know what the fuck he's going to do.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
But I think that's prepared me for life fantastically. And I also think the fear.
But have you reached a limit? Have you?
Tolerance?
Well, of the video game. I mean, you're facing all these charges.
Yeah.
Yeah. So David, I think, is connecting this being out of control and being persecuted by Andrew Tate's dad, and how those feelings might be happening now and how Andrew Tate might be suffering emotionally in that way. And it's interesting that Andrew Tate immediately reframes it of, well, that made me stronger, that because that's his defensive structure. I think and he's not alone. There are millions and I've treated people like this where they cannot be vulnerable. And if they allow any kind of implication that they're vulnerable, they have to very quickly reframe it in a way that makes them not vulnerable, even in their own minds. Even if they don't say it out loud, they'll do this in their head. So this notion, the implication that even as a child, he was being victimized and was vulnerable and out of control, he very quickly thought, but that made me stronger. Now I've developed my system and I've figured it all out. He's telling himself that because in all likelihood, he does not feel in control, and he does not feel strong. He does not feel superior. In fact, he feels the opposite. Today's video is sponsored by Ada. So I got COVID recently. It was probably the sickest I've ever been in my entire life. It was the worst. Well, did you know there are treatments you can take for COVID-19? And that means that there's something you can do if you get COVID, things you can do to avoid getting really sick. And that's where Ada comes in. You take their free questionnaire online. I've taken it. It's confidential. And you find out if you or a loved one may be eligible for treatment. If eligible, you can talk to a clinician via telehealth within 2 hours. And if prescribed, you can pick up your treatment from a local pharmacy. So click the link below to find out if you are eligible and learn more about treatment options.
I'm not sitting there going, how can I be happy in jail? I will sit in jail and say, yes, this sucks. It's supposed to suck. Yes, I'm not enjoying this. Yes, I'm anxious and paranoid. And yes, that guy might stab me, and yes, I can't sleep, and I miss my family, and this is what's supposed to happen to me, and this is how I become the best man I can possibly be, and I'm going to succeed regardless.
You're very convincing. You're so good though, right? It's almost like I feel like you can rationalize anything, right? It's almost like a trick.
Magic trick?
Well, you're really good at talking, you're really smart, and it's almost like any question you can turn. Well, and
yeah, so this is something that perhaps all therapists run into at some point, and will say something like this with someone on the narcissistic spectrum, for example. And there's other people that you might want to say this to, but essentially it's this message from the therapist of like, wow, you have it all figured out. You're smart though. Now, I don't know about Andrew Tate, and I don't know about David, but I can speak from my own experience. I've been in this situation many, many times. It could be someone on the narcissistic spectrum who is an adult. It could be a teenager who is very insecure and trying to promote this idea that they have it all figured out. Teenagers are more prone to this, even if they're not on the narcissistic spectrum. And what you're getting, because as a therapist, you're really trying to help. And often the road we're trying to go down with clients is to get at their vulnerability and their humanness so that they can allow that and honor that because it's a part of being human. And to not honor that and to not allow those emotions to come out is to cause a lot of suffering and anger and distance and rage and addiction and shame. And so we're often trying to help people with that. You know, one could even argue that everyone has this problem because our society is so screwed up. And I know a lot of other people in other societies will tell me that their society is similar, that they will judge people for emotions. And it seems to be some kind of general human bias. That my theory is that for children, when parents are raising children, children have a lot of emotions and they are tired or they're cranky or they're bored or they are, greedy. They want all the toys from their brother. There's just a lot of emotion that they're having. And it can be very inconvenient as a parent to have kids with a lot of emotion. And even for parents that are attuned well enough, they're pretty good parents. There's a limit to how much you can tolerate your child's emotionality. It's like, and a shortcut that I think a lot of parents will resort to because of lack of time and maybe awareness on their part and the way they were parented growing up is they will just shut down emotion. They will just say, stop it, instead of taking the time to attune. And I suspect that there's never been a parent that didn't shut down emotion a significant amount of time, meaning that the best parent in the world will occasionally wrongly and maybe mildly traumatically will shut down emotion in their child, such that in every society, regardless of what tenets they have around parenting, that result will happen such that most adults and even teenagers will have a very intense belief that emotions are generally wrong or shameful or weak or childish or self-indulgent or selfish or something. And everyone needs that assistance to become more human. And so for their benefit and also for their relationships and for society, for politics, for war. I mean, imagine if we didn't have this problem, would war even happen? I mean, sometimes I think like that anyway. So for people who are on the narcissistic spectrum and who present, or people who are presenting in the way that Andrew is like, yeah, sure, I have all these problems. And you hear the way that Andrew Tate was rattling off. And this is another influence that people with narcissism will have on people, including therapists. They will rattle off things, and I'll rewind it. They'll rattle off things that are very, very difficult for anybody. There's just no way that Andrew Tate or anyone else in Andrew Tate's shoes could have dealt with that without a significant amount of emotionality and long-term issues afterwards, right? We could argue Andrew Tate deserved to have those things happen to him because he's talking about being in prison. But independent of that, he is a normal human being. He's not from outer space and would have the normal reaction that people would have. But people on the narcissistic spectrum, people on the avoidant attachment spectrum, they sometimes don't even know their own emotions exist at all. So they're not masking their emotions consciously. They just don't even notice them. And so they will rattle off all these horrible things, and it'll be very intellectual, and it'll give the impression, even to therapists, therapists can be seduced to believing this notion that they're totally fine and they're resilient and they have it all figured out. They don't get sad. They don't get hurt. They don't have an inner child that is crying themselves asleep every night. It can be very convincing, and this happens all the time. It's an inducement. It's a reenactment through projective identification, other kinds of things that the narcissistic client will subconsciously influence me as a therapist to be convinced of that. And at times I have to, that can go on for a long time. I can go for months before I notice something or I consult and I'm like, oh, my therapist did that to me, or my client did that to me. Teenagers can do this to me as well, where I believe that they're an alien from outer space and they don't have vulnerability. They have it all figured out. They're totally fine. And then I have to remind myself that's not possible. No one is totally fine, particularly them. And so the way that Andrew Tate talks, it would be very easy to walk away, even a trained therapist, and believe there's no vulnerability there. He's fine. Everything is fine. So there's some diligence that we therapists have to engage in to remind ourselves, no. Don't be seduced. Don't be influenced. Don't be brainwashed into believing that, because that's what they're doing to themselves. But we have to hold the line and do everything we can to, not just intellectually, but in our heart. We have to find that inner child and really imagine that inner child happening for the client that is acting this way, so that we can not only intellectually hold on to it, but vibe-wise hold on to it, and that's important. So let's rewind that and hear him. For narcissistic people who are on the avoidant attachment spectrum, they will intellectualize. Let's rewind.
Put me back in jail or not. I'm not sitting there going, how can I be happy in jail? I will sit in jail and say, yes, this sucks. It's supposed to suck. Yes, I'm not enjoying this. Yes, I'm anxious and paranoid. And yes, that guy might stab me. And yes, I can't sleep and I miss my family. And this is what's supposed to happen to me. And this is how I become the best man I can possibly be. And I'm going to succeed regardless.
So you hear that he rattled off some of the most fundamental sufferings one could ever go through, of threat of murder, of detachment, forced detachment from your family, and just alone and threatened, and without any power, and uncertain of the future. It's a very dark place to be in for any human being. But then he quickly routes it, and the way he talks about it, he's not like, oh, it was rough to be there. If he had a different personality structure and wasn't treated the way that he was treated growing up, he would probably have that vibe. It's like, oh yeah, it was, he might even cry. That would be normal in that situation. But he just rattles it off. So it's tempting to believe his hype that he's fine and that he doesn't have emotion. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, but isn't he a psychopath? And maybe he is. But psychopaths have emotion. It's not, people on the internet believe psychopaths don't have emotion, or people with autism don't have emotion. It's ridiculous. Every human, except for some very rare circumstances, they have emotion in the same way that they get thirsty or hungry or hot or cold. It's just a part of what it is to be human. Now, they might have subdued emotions. They might not notice their emotions. They might have primordial emotions that never developed. They might express emotions in odd ways.
You're very convincing. You're so good, though, right? It's almost like I feel like you can rationalize anything, right? It's almost like a trick.
Magic trick?
Well, you're really good at talking. You're really smart, and it's almost...
Yeah, so getting back to what I was saying a long time ago, before I went on a bunch of tangents, it's helpful to highlight people on the narcissistic spectrum. It's helpful to highlight their intelligence, even if you don't think they're super smart. They pride themselves in being smart, so it can help to feed that defense, if you will, that need, if you're going to be confronting them, right? And so what he's doing right now is he's basically criticizing him, not in an unhelpful way, but he probably wouldn't characterize it as criticism, but it's a comment that is essentially saying, you frame everything like you have it all figured out, but I don't think you have it all figured out. I think you tell yourself you have it all figured out, and you frame things in a way so that you always figure that so you can narrativize it, that you have it all figured out. But I don't think you actually have it all figured out. I think you're avoiding your vulnerable emotions. I think that's what David is getting at. That would be a helpful thing to say from a therapist. And the efforts that David's been putting into trying to get there has been met frequently with this, I know it all, I have it all figured out, I have total control over everything. And yes, being in prison was all these really horrible things, but, I used it for the better, and I figured it all out. And then that sort of vibe from a therapist is like, wow, you have it all figured out, don't you? Just like this human reaction from the therapist, but also with the hope of telling the client that it's okay that you don't have it all figured out. And also, if you don't allow there's some room in there for the possibility that you could benefit by changing something, then I don't know what else to do. There's a little bit of frustration in what David's saying. It's just like, wow, you got it all figured out. Anyone who has talked to someone on the narcissistic spectrum or a teenager, a lot of teenagers can present this way, will have had that human therapeutic reaction. Now, a therapist could take that too far and be hurtful and cause the client to bolt out of therapy, which doesn't do anyone any good, or just hurtful in some way and cause a client to shut down. But if you do it right, so let's see if he did it right. Let's see how Andrew responds.
Like any question, you can turn and make it work for you, which is great. It's a skill, but there's also a place where there's the potential for self-delusion.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm not even going to sit here and say that I'm not delusional to a degree. I'm not saying that self-delusion doesn't exist. We all are, right? Let me give you a very simple example. Let me try and use an analogy.
Okay, so I think because Andrew Tate likes David, he is allowing David to imply that it's possible that Andrew Tate doesn't have it all figured out. And he even did, look, the potential that maybe you don't have it all figured out, he was tentative. Now, if you really ask David what he really thinks, I'm guessing he would say, I absolutely am certain that Andrew Tate thinks he has it all figured out, but he does not have it all figured out. I'm certain about that. I'm not tentative about that. But he presents it tentatively because he doesn't want to push Andrew Tate away. He doesn't want to insult him. And so he frames it in a tentative way. It's also possible that David also is tentative about it. Over time, for me, I have developed more tentativeness about everything that I think, because if you pay enough attention to yourself as a therapist, you will notice that you're wrong a lot of the time. And I've paid at least enough attention to myself and my thoughts and my conclusions to have concluded that I am wrong often. Maybe not a majority of the time, but enough of the time such that I never know when I'm not wrong in the moment, right? And there's probably a lot of other times I was wrong and never found out I was wrong. So I need to recognize that as I'm saying anything and say it. And you might notice when I talk on this YouTube channel that I hope, present things in a tentative way and never say things are for certain, particularly people I'm watching on YouTube. I mean, how could I possibly? I haven't met them in real life. So that's what David is doing, which is good. All right, well, let's adjourn there. Tune in next time when I continue watching if you care to. And everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.